I've been working on that. I've been really trying to get the down to an appropriate level of depth. Welcome everybody. This is Jason Marlowe, and this is a very special edition of Down and Dirty. For today, I am your solo host. We miss you, John. We hope you are doing well. My name is Jason Marlowe, and we're going to be getting down and dirty as the name states today. We're talking about some local issues and some across the state and country as we all gear up for the apocalypse. Election day next Tuesday. Make sure you get out and vote, everyone. So for today, we are going to start with my guest and very good friend, Hoyt Prindle. Hoyt is a local attorney and former Tampa City Council candidate who wrote an excellent op-ed in the Tampa Bay Times regarding the proposed expansion of I-275 through Tampa's urban core, an expansion proposed by Hillsborough County Commissioner and worst person you don't know, Joshua Wostel. So Hoyt, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell a little bit about yourself?
Well, good morning, Jason, and thank you for having me. I think you did a pretty good job. I'm an attorney and a failed city council candidate, losing by 135 votes, which
I remember.
Is quite fun, let me tell you. But unlike certain people nationally, I made sure to pick up the phone and concede when I lost.
Yeah.
I have had a long time interest in transportation issues, going back to probably being a 4-year-old and being obsessed with maps and traffic lights and everything else. And over time, thanks to the internet, where you can read, looking for the end of the internet, I have been able to get well educated on certain transportation issues and have been fortunate enough to serve the community on a couple different boards. First on the TBARTA Citizens Advisory Committee. And for those of you who don't know, TBARTA is gone. It's no longer around, and for good reason, because it didn't do anything. And then I've also served since 2019 as Commissioner Pat Kemp's appointee to the Hillsborough Transportation Planning Organization's Citizens Advisory Committee.
So before we get into the merits of that op-ed I mentioned, I want to briefly let our listeners know about the Transportation Planning Organization, or TPO, formerly the MPO, formerly known as the artist, formerly known as Prince, meeting on Wednesday evening, in which this extremely controversial proposal regarding the proposed widening of I-275 was brought forth again, and it was voted and approved in a contentious 7-5 vote, despite the vociferous objections of dozens of local citizens. So as a member yourself of the TPO Citizens Advisory Committee, as you just mentioned, or CAC, could you elucidate our listeners a little bit on what exactly the TPO is, what it does, how it works, and how this most recent vote matters to the residents of Tampa's urban core?
So functionally, what the TPO does is provide a local check and balance on state and national transportation planning. So if you would go back 70 or 80 years, some people may have heard of Robert Moses, who was the famed builder of freeways in New York City, who could basically just do whatever he whenever he wanted. You then expand even the early days of the interstate highway system building, where local states and cities were deciding to use freeway building as slum clearance. We had that happen here in Tampa, where the African-American business district along Central Avenue was torn out for the downtown interchange that was put in. And so the TPO is a creation of federal law to provide a local check and balance, and each state propagates a statute or law that describes and sets out how the local TPO will function, who will be on it, and that kind of thing. And then here in Hillsborough, there's a board that's made up of both elected officials within the cities in Hillsborough County and the county, and then there's some non-elected appointees from.
Oh, and we're going to talk about that.
Yes, from entities like the Expressway Authority. And so they are designed to serve as kind of a local check and balance on what the state wants to do. And if they don't want something built in the community, the TPO board has the ability to remove things from the variety of planning documents, such as the TIP. And I know we'll talk briefly about the LRTP.
Yeah. So like the LRTP, because this is a day just loaded with acronyms. We're just hitting you with every conceivable acronym. Long-range transportation planning. Let's talk a little bit about that vote, and a little bit about what you mentioned with the undemocratic nature of the fact that you have non-accountable members of this board taking votes that can directly negatively impact members of this community.
So I think the challenge, at least with the local makeup of the Hillsborough TPO board, it's not that so much that you can't have unelected officials on a board. I think the challenge here is that they make up so much of the board that, even if you get unity from most of the electeds, what kind of happens is what those non-elected members get. And unfortunately, because FDOT drives so much of the funding bus, it has been my observation, even if this is not a direct causal issue, but it's certainly a correlation that a lot of those entities feel required to do and support what FDOT does. And in many cases, that is at opposite ends of the spectrum from what local citizens in the community are demanding.
Yeah, and I mean, to get into that, it's not a recent demand, right? This has been a battle that's well over a decade now between TBX or TB Next, whatever its previous iterations have been. This has been something that FDOT has been after for some time, and frankly, something that the folks of this community have been against for some time. Can you get a little bit into the history of what has gone on in this contentious fight over the last decade?
So, almost a decade ago, or maybe even a little more than a decade ago at this point, FDOT, which for those of you who don't know is the Florida Department of Transportation.
Acronyms.
So this will get a little acronym heavy, so just try to remember all the acronyms and do the best you can. But essentially, FDOT came up with, as you mentioned, Jason, this plan called TBX, which was essentially tolled express lanes for freeway expansion here in the local area on 275, I-4, and I-75. And as part of that project, the FDOT wanted to do a significant expansion within the urban core. The big piece that gets argued about a lot is the portion of 275 from downtown north, because that goes through Seminole Heights. People may forget that 15, 20 years ago, Seminole Heights wasn't the place that it is today. And it was becoming that place in the 2010s. And so you had a lot of very invested neighborhood folks who looked at that and say, well, widening this freeway through our neighborhood is really not going to make this a better place. It's not going to fix transportation outcomes, and it's going to make a lot of things worse. And so you had this organic growth of citizens coming out against the project, and that led to the Sunshine Citizens Group, which I know our mutual friend Michelle Cookson was very involved in, and our other friend Rick Fernandez.
Big shout outs to Michelle and Rick.
Was very involved in, and I'm trying to remember his name. Jason Ball was involved in it. Several people, I couldn't name them all, but essentially organized citizens to push back against that freeway expansion project. And over time, they were able to educate and convince elected officials who sat on that board to take out the widening portion of 275 north of Hillsborough Avenue. And I believe that vote was in 2021, if I recall.
Yes, it was.
And so I'm sure, as we'll talk about this year, we've had a desire to bring back typewriters and go back to putting that project on the board.
I mean, to your point, it really does feel like both again, worst person Commissioner Wostel and FDOT doubling down on really anachronistic, outdated ideology. I mean, we're talking about every other city, metropolitan region in the country, let alone the world, right, are trying to find ways to help folks get from where they want to go to their home and back without using a car because of the congestion, because of the pollution, because of a million reasons. And it seems like here we're thinking about spending about $500 million on 11 miles of lane north to south. For those who maybe aren't familiar, we're talking from Bears to Hillsborough Avenue, 1 lane north, 1 lane south, within the existing right-of-way. But again, this is 2-3 years of construction, $400 minimum million. I mean, it certainly feels like spending a whole lot of money to what are we going to warehouse Zeppelins? Are we going to build more parking posts for our horses?
Well, you know what this feels like to me is there's a term I've heard, especially conservatives use, called virtue signaling. And this project also almost seems more like virtue signaling than it is something that people genuinely believe we have to fix transportation here. It almost comes across to me as if you want to say own the libs, right? An own the libs moment of, we're not going to, even though this is really not a partisan thing. I mean, you can go down Seminole Heights and Republicans against it too. But it strikes me as, at least from some of the county folks out in East County, especially, as kind of an own the libs thing where it's like, we're gonna put this freeway through your neighborhood and you're gonna like it, and
whether you like it or not.
Right. And I've yet to hear a good justification for why we have to go back on something we took out, why we have to have this. Because a lot of people that are against freeway building, what the opponents say is, they just don't want to build any roads. And I don't think that's true at all, right? I mentioned in the op-ed, certain regional connections. If they wanted to build a freeway across State Road 54 in Pasco County, I wouldn't, drive up there to object to it like, some folks in Pinellas County do to drive over here and object to transit things. So it's really just disappointing to see that the community spent years, at least 7 years, and a lot of time and education and sitting with elected officials and getting everybody up to speed on what the project was about to have it come out. And then, Commissioner Mwosel out of the blue makes his motion.
Zombie motion.
To put it back in. And now we're fighting about it again. And now, I was not at the meeting on Wednesday, but I understand it was very contentious. I understand people were very emotional, that they had to clear the room at one point. Yep. And, we had gotten past all that. And so why we want to go back to that to put in one additional lane that's not going to fix traffic, that's going to cost all that money, doesn't make any sense to me.
So if you want to join the conversation with me and Hoyt Prindle, feel free to call us at 813-239-9663. Again, that's 813-239-9663. So let's actually use that opportunity. You mentioned it, and so now we're going to dive into it. Let's talk about the op-ed you published in response to Commissioner Wosel's motion in June. That piece, which you haven't read, please do read. It's entitled "Widen I-275 and Watch the Traffic Jam Up." You went into some pretty sincere detail about the potential consequences of this $500 million boondoggle. Why did you feel compelled to write it? And for those who haven't read it, why don't you tell folks what you wanted to get across?
Well, my general view of Tampa and how we should approach not only transportation policy, but policy in general is, we need to do things here that are the absolute best in the country or the world to the extent we can. We don't need to be small-minded. But even below that, let's not do things worse than an average city somewhere else in the country, right? Because to me, if you're effectuating good policy and then people want to come here to learn about it and take it back to where they are, then that means you're doing things right for your citizens and hopefully their quality of life is improved. And so, some of my frustration is if you look around the country, within the urban core, right? Obviously the country is still building freeways, but within the urban core, there has been a movement to stop freeway expansion and in many cases tear out freeways. Even in Houston, they had a long discussion about tearing out what's called the Pierce Elevated Freeway, right? So even a place like Texas, which is very known for its freeways, talking about, tearing out a freeway. Here, it's like we're doing the opposite. We want to tear out more homes, tear out more land to expand the urban freeway. And it's not going to solve traffic. It's going to cost a lot of money. Now in FDOT's defense for a second, the state has made it very difficult to fund transit here. So it isn't as if FDOT can just wag a wand and build transit, right? As we get in these discussions and you hear us talking about the issues with transit, I want you to remember that the state controls the law on that, and your state representatives hold probably more power on that issue than anybody else. But so the reason I wrote the op-ed is just to kind of educate the community on what else is going on in the country to show the contrast between what they're doing and what Tampa's doing. And some of the examples I used in there, one was the Woodall-Rogers Freeway in Dallas, and that is essentially a freeway that cuts off the north part of downtown from certain parts of uptown. And what they did there was they spent a lot of money to build a cap over the freeway and put up urban park in. So they reconnected these portions of downtown and uptown in Dallas, and it's really a thriving area now. It's got bars and restaurants, and you walk in the park and you wouldn't even know a freeway is beneath you, right? And they had to spend a lot of money to do that, but it's improved, the quality of life and the walkability there in that section of Dallas. Another project that is notable was the Alaskan Way Viaduct in Seattle. And so essentially there was an elevated double-decker freeway along the waterfront in Seattle that was built in the late 40s, early 50s, but it cut off a lot of the downtown area from the waterfront and had been an eyesore. And so local officials in Seattle had a project where they tore out the Alaskan Way Viaduct and built a tunnel to connect essentially the freeway to the other end of Alaskan Way on the north side of downtown. And so what that's done is taken all of this property and put it back on the tax rolls, and all of a sudden, hey, you got a building now, you can see out to Puget Sound, you're not blocked by a double-decker freeway. And, so everybody's been very pleased with how that project has gone. There's been others, such as the Big Dig in Boston, which, certainly was notable for how long it took and some of the cost overruns. But now that it's done, everybody there loves it. And if you see pictures of that compared to the old elevated central artery that used to go through Boston, it's really a transformational difference. There's others, such as the Embarcadero Freeway that was torn out in San Francisco. I don't use that example a ton because when you say San Francisco, people just like it's the California boogeyman, and so people just stop listening at that. But they had a freeway that was damaged from the 1989 earthquake, and the same kind of deal with Seattle, where it had cut off a lot of downtown from the waterfront and tore it out, and now it's a thriving district as well. So those are just some examples. We could certainly get into others with more time.
No, listen, we're going to go to our very first caller, John. Welcome to the conversation. Are you there, John?
Yeah, or I'll throw water all over. Well, as a reporter, I covered these local governments for a long time. MPO. To talk about all that so mildly, they have programs that are 40 years out, 20 years out, 10 years out. Usually the members of the MPO are local officials. And they're all, a few of them were born here or have enough experience about a city or a town or even a neighborhood that takes care of itself, that understands things. I mean, when I left one town, you had, over 300 bonds that it was floating.
Well, forgive me, John. So what did you want to get across?
I wanted to get across that all these little fixes and stuff that they keep talking about are just more measures to add more and more and more. And the only thing that we have are just more and more problems.
No, listen, it's certainly an issue, and it certainly feels like these folks don't care too much about our community. We got one more call. We're going to switch to caller number 2. Bonnie, welcome. You are on the air. Bonnie, you there?
Hi, yes, good morning.
Oh, Connie. Hey, Connie, how you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Enjoy the show. I just wanted to say this. Sometimes it just grips my stomach when I hear these new definitions for once destroyed black community as the urban core. Because nobody talks about how we repaired that damage, but people continue to move on with these new concepts. I ride bus number 1 a lot, and the city has now gone into efforts to say, what's that?
I think we lost you, Connie.
Hello?
Hello, you still there?
I'm sorry, yeah. So the city's going into this extra effort to pay for passengers to run to ride route number 1 next year for free. And most of the people that's on the buses is poor working class people because folks don't want to give up their cars. And so until you make it harder for people to be able to drive, I don't know if it's an additional gasoline tax or whatever, people go hold on to their cars. And so the tearing up neighborhoods to try to convince people to ride, these new concepts, I think, is kind of like backwards until there's a will for them. It might be a need for them, but the people don't have the willingness to move forward.
No, 100%. I think one of the greatest issues, I think, if we could talk about what HART could do with 400, and thank you again so much for your call, Connie. What HART could do with $400 million versus spending it on expanding lanes 2 ways. To Connie's point, so many working class people who maybe can't afford a car with how expensive car insurance here, let alone maintenance, et cetera. Why aren't we doing more to expand the existing transportation networks that we have?
Well, again, that comes down to the elected officials that we put in office. And, right now that is mostly controlled at the state level. I think you have some very perceptive local elected officials, like Alan Clendenin, who understand transit issues and go and advocate for them. I know certainly Lynn Hertak has been a very strong defender of transit and rides the bus herself. And that's not to say that others don't, but they stand out kind of early as advocating for transit. It's mostly a function of the state. You got to change the makeup of the state government or who's there to get them to change some of the laws about how we fund transportation projects. And, Connie's right. I mean, certainly, if it becomes more difficult to drive, then yes, people might take another option. But I've always looked at it to say, let's focus on making the public transit safe, convenient, and reliable. And if you do that, people will take it.
100%. I mean, before we sort of segue into some different matters, I do want to give you an opportunity to talk about your op-ed and the concept of induced demand. And this idea that for maybe those who don't understand the concept, why is the counterintuitive true that if you build more lanes, you only increase traffic?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And it is very counterintuitive, which is why it's hard for people, I think, to initially understand, because I think the average person says, okay, if there's a 4-lane freeway and that's expanded to 6 lanes, well, now there's more lanes to travel
Houston
on.
has entered the chat.
Well, yeah, we'll get there.
Oh, I hope we don't.
I mean, in terms of the discussion. And so it's just this natural thought, okay, there's more lanes, so it'll be easier to drive. And induced demand is, based on economic principles, but what the studies have shown is that once you widen it, it induces, to use that word, more people to drive. And then while initially when the freeway opens with the widened expansion, you usually have a reduction in travel times. In not too short amount of time, it gets worse than before. And you mentioned Houston and the Katy Freeway in Houston, which
I still have nightmares.
Goes west from downtown Houston out to the town, Katy, Texas, hence the name. They have widened that up to, if you include what are called the feeder roads in Houston, which most of the Texas freeways have service roads, along the side of it. It's like up to 26 lanes, I think, between all the freeway, express lane, feeder road lanes.
Just one more lane, bro. One more lane, it'll solve the problem, bro.
Well, right. And so after they did this $1 billion expansion, they saw the travel times get worse. Same thing on the 405 in Los Angeles.
We're not going to talk about the 405. Halloween was yesterday. We're leaving nightmares in the past.
Yeah. So everybody... as I mentioned, everybody should know that freeway if they ever watched the O.J. Simpson chase. That's what he drove down for most of it. But Caltrans, which is the California Department of Transportation, spent over $1 billion to expand the 405 through Sepulveda Pass, which basically is Sunset Boulevard north into the valley. And you may have heard on the news reports at times the Carmageddon, where they literally shut down the entire 405 to do some work on the Mulholland Drive bridge there, and so they widened it and opened it, and once again travel times got worse. And I like to point to Los Angeles for road and freeway building, because Los Angeles did things 80 years ago that we're trying to do now. And so and they just said, hey, we're going to build lots of freeways, we're going to build lots of roads, right? They ripped out the red car and the street cars they had, and they were really the first metropolitan area in the country to build out a massive freeway network. And what do you know? Pretty much right away, even in the 50s, they had these ridiculous traffic jams that Don Rickles or Johnny Carson would joke about. And so eventually they got to a place kind of in the 1990s, at least in LA County, where they said, okay, we're not going to build any more freeways because we've spent all this money, we've done it for 40 years, and the traffic still is terrible. And so that's when they've, in LA County, tried to focus more on building transit. And so what I'd like to do here is not to say, again, you're never going to build another road, but skip the 40 years of us building roads and spending a lot of money without building transit, so that we don't have to put our residents through that kind of uncertainty and difficulty with construction and tearing everything out for a result that we know is not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned pretty succinctly how a lot of the issues reside with the state. I guess to some extent, beyond just our region and the issues we have locally with some very misguided local elected officials, what do you think our area can do to make transportation work? As we've talked about consistently, right? So many of these other communities across the country and across the world figured out ways to do what we're trying to do so much better than we do. What do you think we can do to improve the transportation networks here regionally? Well,
at first, I think we have to start with an education campaign for the populace so that the populace understands what effective transportation measures and systems are and do. And because if we do that and we get the public on the side of building more transit, then eventually the elected officials typically come along. And locally, within the stuff that's in our control, I mean, it certainly was great when FDOT made the streetcar free. I think you saw the massive increase in ridership
100%.
once that happened. I applaud City Council for putting money towards the HART bus route on Route 1 to have that be free as kind of a pilot project. And I think what you'll see is they'll get a lot more ridership because it's free. I mean, it's like if you make a road free, people drive on it. If you make the bus free, people ride the bus. So those are some things locally I think that they've done a good job on. But really, we're going to have to educate and convince our state legislators to invest in transit in this community. And I don't know why they can't, because they built Sunrail over in Orlando. Okay, so do you mean to tell me that Orlando's a better metropolitan area than Tampa, that Orlando's more worthy and that's why they get Sunrail? I mean, we ought to be able to get something like that here. And no, it's not going to fix problems overnight. But collectively, we start making the right decisions now, we'll get to better transportation outcomes in the future.
All right, we're going to go really quickly to DeAndre in Brandon. DeAndre, quickly, you are on the air. What do you have to say to add to the conversation?
I was just curious. I don't know if I missed it, but had you guys discussed afforestation, like along roads to help deal with the heat and protecting citizens and their travels, whether they're pedestrians and as well automobiles, because there are a couple things. One, we're dealing with climate change. I sometimes see a lot of homes like really close to the roads.
Yeah.
Like major traffic activity on roads that were originally for home and development areas.
No, it's a lot of bad planning. But forgive me. So what exactly was your question, DeAndre?
I was curious. Are you also factoring in afforestation to help in cooling, and putting up trees in different spaces, or backing homes off of high traffic? Now high traffic areas for the sake of safety for families who may reside in those homes.
Awesome.
I was just curious if...
No, thank you very much for your question, DeAndre.
So certainly the city's got a wonderful tree canopy. It's an interesting question that he raises in the sense that I'm not familiar even with transit projects of a focus on utilizing trees and other things to assist with climate change. So that's something I'd have to look into. It's not something I've ever heard discussed.
But we do know, I'll say for whatever it's worth, we do know asphalt is a giant heat sink. Roads, I think typically become exponentially hotter than your other traditional surfaces, So,
right.
There is, I think, some connection there. But we're going to go to one more call. We have Tom from Tampa. Tom, you are on the air. Welcome to the conversation.
Like a Halloween blue wig and some makeup, and then
Tom, you there?
Yes, I am. I just wanted to mention, with this transportation issue, and I've been looking at this for some years now. Have they considered cable cars? I know in Bolivia they use them there, in Mexico City, and they're using them in parts of Atlanta and different parts of the country. But cable cars could connect us with St. Pete going across the bay. Could connect us throughout a spider web of these cable cars could take the transportation to another level, because you just wouldn't have that many cars, and people have a tendency to want to text. I know they say it's against the law to text and drive, but everybody does it anyhow. You can sit in these cable cars, you can text, chat, talk on your phone, do whatever, but it would actually be a lot safer for people, and you could have it set up where the students, you could even have it where the buses don't have to pick up the students. They could take the cable cars.
There was we had a mayoral candidate back, and thank you so much for calling in, Tom. We had a mayoral candidate back in 2019, Topher Morrison, who very famously tried to suggest air gondolas, which I don't know how well that might work in the lightning capital of the United States. But yeah, to your point, Tom, I think, and I'll let Hoyt get in on this as well, but I think we do need to find ways, right, to just get people out of their cars, offer people reliable, safe, convenient transportation that can get them from where they want to go to where they want to go.
So I, as you mentioned, I think the challenge in this area with what I think of as like a gondola would be the severe weather that we get here with thunderstorms and heavy wind would likely make that those get shut down for significant portions of time. for a good chunk of the year, and so that would be challenging. I like the concept, right? Because theoretically, you're not disrupting the street uses as much, but I think there's some other tried and true methods, such as the streetcar, such as light rail, such as heavy rail, that we would need to invest in first before perhaps investing in something like the cable car project.
Yeah, I just think I think in the end, right, so much of the issue in this area is there is no means outside of HART, which I mean, as our friend of the show and friend of ours, Commissioner Kemp, has said a million times, it's the most underfunded transit agency of its size in the United States by a long metric. And I think you can sort of see how devastating that's been on Tampa Transit because they don't have the money to provide, the things that we've talked about, convenient, safe, reliable transit that people will want to use more consistently.
Well, even compare that in the local region. So PSTA, which is the Pinellas Transit Agency, gets a full mill in property tax, and HART only gets a half. So essentially, PSTA is working with double the money, and obviously they have less people in Pinellas County, but that's a big problem. I think Commissioner Kemp has talked about going to the full mill at some point, and that's something that people should consider. But, certainly being able to get some more state investment, I think, in HART is very important because that's what we can fix most quickly. Buses can be adapted. We can buy more buses. That's kind of the quick fix. I do think rail of some kind is the more longer-term fix and the more appropriate fix.
So we're going to use this as an interesting opportunity to sort of segue into the upcoming election day on Tuesday. What are some local races, Hoyt, that you are particularly keeping a close eye on, and why?
So obviously the county-wide elected officials are all very important races that I'm taking a look at. The only one that's not up of the there's two not up for the constitutionals, Nancy Milan, the tax collector, and Chad Chronister, the sheriff, both of whom did not face opposition in their reelection campaign. So we have three elected officials up in the county. We have Cindy Stewart, who is the clerk of court. We have comptroller. We have Bob Henriquez, who is the property appraiser.
Coach.
And then we have the well-known state attorney's race, where the duly elected state attorney Andrew Warren is facing
Marshall Patan,
the current DeSantis-installed state attorney Susie Lopez. And so I'm going to be very curious to see how those races turn out compared to the national races because, Jason, as you know, split ticket voting has really gone down over the last decade to 20 years. And so oftentimes, whatever the top of the ticket does, that affects every other race down ballot. We know this from 2022.
I was literally going to say.
Where Kim Overman and Mariella Smith, two very good county commissioners, lost both of their races because of a Democratic turnout collapse and DeSantis' strong margin in the state. And I don't think. I mean, certainly there was money against Kim, with Mr. Wostel, but Donna Cepeda raised what, $20,000 in that campaign?
I think about $24,000,
which for a countywide race is nothing. And I don't think anybody anywhere.
It's hard to make money when all you do is hawk rosary beads on Etsy.
Well, but again, she didn't run a serious campaign, and she won. And the reason she won is because she had an R next to her name. And so I'm curious to see, is 2022 a predictor of the future of what's going to happen in Florida now that the National Democratic Party money is gone? Or was it a little bit more of an outlier? So far, what we can see is that Republicans are coming out in very strong numbers here to vote in Florida. And even in Hillsborough County, where when I checked this morning, there was roughly a 10,180 vote lead. Or I shouldn't say vote. It's voters who have voted, because we don't know how they're going to vote. But if we're just looking at the party ID statistics, 10,180 more Republicans than Democrats had voted. Historically, what would happen is there would be a massive amount of Democrats who would vote early in VBM, and there would be this very large lead, and then Republicans would come in on the back end and close it. So the concern is if Republicans are leading now and Democrats don't get out and vote on Election Day, there will be that Republican surge on Election Day, and a lot of the countywide electeds will not survive.
Yeah, I guess the question to some extent, and I know there are a million people doing more high-level data work than I, but how much of that vote the Republican Election Day vote that they've been so reliably building on for a very long time? How much have they cannibalized in early voting? We really won't know that until the conclusion of Tuesday's election.
That's right. I mean, there's some people who get access and go dive more deep into the data. I don't have the time and don't have the access to it, so I can just kind of see the basic numbers. But if you were looking at the basic numbers right now and you assume no crossover votes, right? So that every Republican who votes straight Republican, every Democrat who votes straight Democratic. Your outlier are the MPAs. And right now we'd have to win a little bit more than 55% of the MPA vote in order to have the local elected Democrats win. So, Republicans are very happy about what their turnout is doing here. For Democrats, I think it's time to, make calls and get your voters out, if you want to keep some of these qualified electeds countywide in office.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen such a drastic change here in Hillsborough County. I mean, this was a county that, voted for President Obama twice. It voted for President Biden. It voted for Hillary. And now it looks like in 2024, who knows, this could potentially become a red county. Can we talk a little bit about, the concerns about the dramatic nature of that shift, particularly, as you mentioned, post-2022, in which once it appears that National Democratic Party money has dried out of Florida, that suddenly there's just not enough voter mobilization to help meet the Republican machine here?
So certainly because Republicans in the state have won time and time again, they have unlimited resources at their disposal. And the Republican Party of Florida has done a very good job of registering voters. For years, decades, the Democratic Party here had a voter registration advantage. And that voter registration advantage got stronger during the Obama years because Obama, in his two campaigns, did an excellent job of coming in here and registering more Democrats to vote. The Republicans figured out that it's very important to have more registered voters, right? Because you know who to send your communications to, when they vote. And so they've made a very concerted effort and now have a massive lead in voter registrations. And even within Hillsborough County, while Democrats still lead, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but it's narrowed quite a bit. And the other thing Republicans are doing is using their money to target non-party affiliated voters to register as Republicans. So my girlfriend Tiffany is an MPA, and she gets like handwritten notes from like local Republican precinct people about, do you believe in these beliefs on this palm card? And if so, will you consider changing your registration? I have not seen or heard anything like that from the local Democrats.
And I mean, the MPAs, I think people should not underestimate how sizable of a percentage they are of the voting electorate. To your point, about 160,000 Republicans, 150,000 Democrats, about 100,000 NPAs. So when we talk about how non-affiliated voters will decide the election, at least here locally, that is not a misnomer. That is fact.
Well, and I suspect the MPA number is only going to grow because what you're seeing across the country is that a lot of people don't want to be associated with one party or the other. Now, most non-party affiliated voters, or in other states what they would classify as an independent, typically tend to lean one way or the other. They typically tend to vote Republican or they typically tend to vote Democrat. But you're seeing this growth of people who just don't want to be registered as a party because they don't want to be branded as such because they don't agree with what the party's doing all of the time. And so to your point, NPAs will be an increasingly important slice of the electorate as we go forward.
Yeah, and I would say for whatever it's worth, having done a little bit of digging into 2020, I mean, I think even, the smaller, the third-party candidates, your libertarians, your Robert Kennedys of the world, I think will have some influence on this election nationally. I mean, if you look at some of the states where Trump lost by 20, 30, 40,000 votes, and then you go look at how many votes Danny Yerkinson, the libertarian candidate, got, you realize that, I mean, if all of those votes are effectively Trump votes that he lost, that's where he lost the election potentially. In Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in several of these other states, he was literally hamstrung by the third-party candidate.
Well, that's right. And in a first-past-the-post system where you don't typically need to reach a majority to win, third-party candidates usually just play the role of spoiler. The most famous
Ralph
one in my
Nader
mind
has entered the chat.
Ralph Nader in 2000. And Al Gore would be president if Ralph Nader didn't run for president that year. To your point, there's been other third-party candidates that have negatively affected Republicans. I think John Tester in Montana has benefited in his past elections from a libertarian candidate being on the ballot and thus ciphering away what most would assume are Republican votes.
The Jordan Peterson crowd.
So I like you, I will be very interested to see it. And what people have to remember is every state does ballot access differently, right? So RFK is not on the ballot in Florida, and he's not running for president, but to my knowledge, he's still on the ballot in Wisconsin, and he's still on the ballot in Michigan. And most people presume that that's going to negatively affect Trump. I don't think Jill Stein's on the ballot in every state either. So it's really very state dependent. The other thing that's interesting too is how it's organized on the ballot. In this state, my recollection is the state law is that the first ballot is the current holder of the governor's office, and so that's always been Republicans because Republicans have won every governor's race.
Which means they get to be at the top of the ballot on every single item.
Right, but in other states, it's alphabetical by party name, right? So Republicans may be very much lower. There's all these little things that affect that,
and these nuances matter. I mean, to my understanding, as I recall, you can, as I was taught many moons ago, I think being at the top of the ballot is like it's almost considered an automatic 3%.
Right, and I certainly where it's more of an effect is on down ballot races where, for president,
people are just scrolling down that ballot.
People know who Trump is. People know who Vice President Harris is. But, especially if you get down into races like soil and water or judges, I mean, it's difficult to know, even if you're somebody that reads a lot, who these people are and how to vote. And so, yes, certainly, I think statistics have shown that being first on the ballot is helpful to a degree.
So let's extrapolate. I guess we're going to, we've done a little bit talking about Hillsborough County. I do want to just give a quick shout out for those who are paying attention to the county races. Keep in mind that these have direct correlation to our earlier conversation. So if you are concerned about transportation policy in Hillsborough County, make sure you're getting out there and voting all the way down the ballot on all of these initiatives.
Yeah, the one race we didn't talk about also that's a county-wide race is the Board of County Commissioners District 7 seat, which Pat Kemp is termed out of. Sean Shaw is running against Chris Bowles for that particular race. And so, that's going to be a very interesting race because if Sean wins, you have kind of a status quo for now with a 4-3 Republican board. But if he were to lose, it would be a 5-2 Republican board. And of course, those county commissioners serve on different boards like the TPO board, and so replacing and I don't know what Mr. Bowles' positions are, but just given how strong Pat has been on transit issues, if you were to replace Pat with Mr. Bowles, I suspect you'd see a drastic difference in policy. Knowing Sean, I know Sean is supportive of transit, and so I think you'd see him vote much more similarly to Pat on those issues.
So let's go beyond the county. Let's look, and talk a little bit about how things are looking at the state, amendments 3 and 4, and then with our last really 10 minutes, let's sort of just extrapolate about the national picture.
So the state amendments are going to be very interesting. The ones that people focus on the most are Amendment 3, which is to legalize recreational marijuana, and Amendment 4, which is to place into the state constitution an abortion amendment that says that abortions will not be restricted up until the point of viability, which most people would agree is 22 or 24 weeks at this point. And so there's been a lot of money spent on those amendments, and
our taxpayer dollars, in fact, being invested by DeSantis into using weaponizing Department of Health and Department of Transportation to advocate against those initiatives.
Yeah, that's been very concerning, especially sending threatening letters to television stations about running ads. I mean, regardless of how you feel on the subject matter, I would hope we all could agree that we really don't want politicians using the functions of the state like that to affect ballot initiatives. But some of the polling I've seen, I think the Amendment 3 polls higher than Amendment 4. It's really going to depend on who turns out to vote, right? I do expect you're going to get Republican crossover for this amendment, pretty significant Republican crossover, especially with Republican women. And I would expect almost all Democrats to vote for it. But for those who may not know, in Florida, you have to get to 60% for a constitutional amendment to pass. And so I think everybody would agree if it was 50, it would win. Even DeSantis himself has said that it'll get over 50, right? The question is it going to get to 60? I heard some recent polling that it was in the 57% range. Yeah. But again, just functionally, if the electorate is more Republican, let's say that Trump and Scott win the state by 12, 13, 14 points, which is not outside the realm of possibility, especially if you look at, I forget the Republican pollster's name, who put out a memo that based on the early vote, they were projecting maybe a 12-point win here. So if you have those kind of margins at the top of the ticket, it's going to be very difficult for those, at least for the abortion amendment to pass, because you're going to have more Republican voters, and Republicans tend to not support abortion rights in the way that Democrats do. But again, we just really don't know. There's been a lot of speculation about the silent woman voter right. Are women going to tell people publicly that they're voting for one thing and then go into the ballot booth and do something else? We'll find out on election night.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say going beyond the state, I mean, what we're seeing in the battleground states across the country is that women are voting at an extraordinary rate. I think the numbers that I saw were 55 to 45 currently. And I mean, I think that's a direct result, I would imagine, of the repeal of Roe v. Wade and a lot of the exceptionally misogynistic rhetoric we're seeing out of the Trump campaign and his subsidiaries. I mean, like, it's clearly having an effect on the race that is not in Trump's direction. And I think you've seen even Megyn Kelly and Nikki Haley coming out and basically, ringing the alarm bell about stop the bromance. It's not pulling in the voters that you need to build a winning coalition.
I did see Nikki Haley's comments on that, and that's true, right? A lot of the rhetoric is very offensive to women, right? And this
gonna protect you whether you want it or not.
Yeah, that was a very
big factor.
That was a very interesting quote, but kind of on brand for what Donald Trump says usually. But to your point, yes, women are turning out in the early vote substantially. It's stronger in states in the blue wall, a little bit less significant in a state like Nevada. And Nevada is probably the state I would keep an eye on in terms of your states that have voted Democratic consistently since 2004, but by narrower margins than other blue states. And so as we've seen this trend line since Hillary took office and continuing, really the gap in partisanship now is on educational lines. And if you're a college-educated voter, you tend to vote Democratic. And if you're a non-college-educated voter, certainly non-college-educated white voter, you tend to vote for Republicans. And, there's been all this speculation about has Trump made inroads with non-college-educated African-American and Hispanic voters. And so Nevada is a state that does not have a high amount of college-educated voters. It's still a state where due to the unions out there, the culinary union and a lot of the casino jobs, that you don't necessarily have to have a college degree to make a decent living. And so, it's very possible that Vice President Harris could win the election pretty sizably in Electoral College and still lose Nevada just because of some of the shifts there. But we also don't know what's happening because Nevada does automatic registration as a non-party affiliated unless you select the party. And so what the Democrats are saying is that the NPA vote there is going to be significantly Democratic, and they think that they're going to be able to pull out a tight race on Election Day, but we'll see.
So what about some of the other states? Obviously, we discussed the blue wall a little bit. It certainly does feel like the numbers that I've seen out of Pennsylvania would appear that might be out of Trump's reach, but obviously that still leaves you with Wisconsin and Michigan. And then obviously in the Sun Belt, you have the states of North Carolina and Georgia that are both very interesting.
So the consensus Sun Belt states for everybody is Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Those are the ones that everybody kind of looks at as swing states. Georgia and North Carolina are interesting. I think you could see a scenario where those two states actually flip, where Georgia might go red and North Carolina might go blue. It's really going to come down to turnout in the Atlanta area. I mean, that is
Cook County.
Atlanta, you're thinking of Chicago.
Thank you.
Fulton County is Atlanta. You have Fulton County, Gwinnett County, Cobb County, DeKalb County. Those are your kind of core big urban counties there in Atlanta. And if they turn out like they do in 2020, and the vice president will have a very good chance to win. If not, she won't. But North Carolina is kind of interesting. You have a few different dynamics going. You have the portion of the western part of the state with its heavy Republican that was dealt with the significant flooding damage and how many of those people are still going to vote. You also have a very, very extreme Republican candidate for governor, Mark Robinson, who the National Party has abandoned. And so Josh Stein is expected to win that race pretty large. And so I think you could almost see a reverse scenario where, because of that massive gap in the Stein-Robinson race, that you might get some people to come over and vote for Kamala on that. And, she'll have a very good chance to win there. But I would expect all of these races to be fairly close. We don't know if it'll be called on election night. We hope. But there are differences in different states about how they count votes. Not every places like Florida, where the early vote and VBM are tabulated, and basically at 7 o'clock, those numbers get released. In other states, they're not allowed to start counting until the polls close. And other states, like Nevada, will still allow ballots up to be postmarked, up to 3 days late. Or there's some very funky state laws, and that makes for slow counting in other states.
But I mean, in the end, where I guess you mentioned the possibility of Vice President Harris, winning large electorally. I guess, is there any particular state where you think you see a surprise, or what would be your final electoral count if you had to throw a number out there right now?
That's very tough, because I can look at information that says Trump's going to win, and I can look at information that says Kamala's going to win. I think if I was forced to right now,
you are being forced right now.
I'd probably say that she'll sweep the blue wall. She will win Nebraska 2, which is the Omaha district. Nebraska does their electoral votes by congressional district and the 2 senators. And that I'll say that she'll lose Nevada right now until I see better numbers, but that she'll win North Carolina, and she'll win Arizona, and she'll lose Georgia. So I don't know what the math is. It's probably a little under 300, but if I was taking a guess, that's what I would do. I really want to see what the election day numbers are for the African-American turnout in Georgia. We'll see there. But Arizona, to me, is a very interesting state, because while Trump has polled well there, there's a lot of college-educated voters in Maricopa County, which is Phoenix, and that's one of the largest counties in the country. There's 5 million residents in Maricopa, I think. It's one of the top 5 vote getters in the country. A lot of college-educated voters. But the other thing is you have a lot of Mormon voters. And as we know, Mormons have not typically been very fond of Donald Trump. And I was reading the other day, I think in Politico, that there's some current concern with the Trump folks about maybe some weak numbers amongst the Mormon folks. So that's how I would look at it. But I think she could very easily sweep it all and get to 319. She could very easily lose. And if I think she does, it's because Trump sweeps the Sun Belt and probably gets Pennsylvania. I think it's going to be tough for him to get Michigan regardless. Michigan's the most Democratic of those 3 states, and some of the early vote numbers I've seen in Detroit are very, very strong there. And so the vice president looks pretty good in the blue wall, but if I had to guess, Pennsylvania, just with how much the parties have put in resource-wise there, that would be the one that he would pick off.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it would appear, obviously the largest electorally with 19 votes, but to your point, it would be 297 would be the scenario in which you project, in which the vice president loses Nevada but wins Arizona, wins North Carolina, et cetera.
Nevada.
Oh God, it always happens.
Remember the John Kerry story?
Yes. Why? It's just a horrible Freudian slip where I can never get the name of this state right. So real quick, I guess we have about 1 minute left. Anything you'd like to leave our listeners with in regards to the elections, or locally or nationally, or in regards to our earlier conversation related to transportation?
I think the big thing I want to tell people is get out and vote, and do the best you can to educate yourself on each race that you're voting for, and pay especially close attention to the down ballot races that don't get talked about on the news. We have a very good clerk of court in Cindy Stewart. She's doing an excellent job. She's gotten awards for best places to work.
And I'll add an excellent supervisor of elections. Having seen the recount in person, I can't speak more wholeheartedly on behalf of Craig Latimer.
I always forget about Craig, and Craig has a delicate balance because, he's the supervisor of elections, so he can't campaign in the same way. And of course, Bob Henriquez has done a masterful job with the property appraiser's office, has done a very good job of trimming the budget there. Some really excellent county elected officials. So when you go out and you vote for president, don't forget them. It's important that you go out and vote for them. And of course, the state attorney's race, Andrew Warren, having been the duly elected state attorney there, important to send him back to do the job voters elected him to do.
And it's a long ballot, so please make sure that you do go all the way down the ballot. Don't forget, as you mentioned, the both statewide amendments, and also we have the 2 local amendments. We have both the county-wide amendment in regards to the potential millage increase for teachers. We have this community investment tax potentially being renewed, and then lastly, we have the city Tampa charter amendment about whether or not folks who, make C-suite level executive salaries here in the city of Tampa should be required to live in the city of Tampa. So thank you so much, Hoyt Brindle. You were an excellent guest. This has been a wonderful episode of Down and Dirty. We wanted to have Commissioner Wostel on, but we ran out of time, unfortunately. And have a wonderful Friday, and make sure you get out there and vote, everybody.